Well, I had a wonderful example of using performance conversations because I was getting my gutter cleaned, and I was having a very hard time of getting the person to do it. And all along I realized that I wasn't getting the proper request from him, because he kept saying, I'm going to do it as soon as the weather clears up. You know, as soon as we've got you on the schedule, there's an opening, we'll do it. And a month and a half goes by, and finally I'm like, he hasn't lied to me yet. I mean, you know, that he's going to do it when there's an opening, and obviously I've not suggested an opening enough. So, you know, then I sent something back to him that was very angry, and then I looked at it again. I was like, wait, I need to like frame this. So it's like, listen, either get here by Sunday and clean the gutters and tell me that you're going to do that in a reply, or reply back to me and say you're not going to do it, so that I can find somebody else to.
Oh, that's great.
And then it's like, then the reply is, we'll be there by Sunday. And he was. So, you know, it was his fault, but he's like, as soon as the weather clears up, we'll be able to do it. It's like in April.
Yeah. No, that's really great, because one of the key things that we find people leave out, and Steve and Jen have been sitting in on my Mastery of Execution class, and they've been keeping track of, they and everybody in the class is keeping track of the promises made to them and the promises that they're making. And the one thing that's consistently left out is by when. So we don't have a by when. And as I tell the class, if you don't ask for a by when, you give up all rights to complain about not getting it. Because the other person has no way of knowing when you want that. So they can't organize themselves appropriately to give it to you when you want it. That won't stop us from complaining about it or holding them accountable. But in reality, if you don't give people the information necessary to deliver, you give up the right to complain about them not delivering. That's the theory anyway, not always the practice. That's great, Doug. The thing I've learned is when somebody gives you something without a deadline, if you ask them by when they want it, they don't like that. They don't like being asked by when. It sounds confronting, or it sounds, I don't know, there's something, you know, it's like, can you have this for me? By when do you want that? It's like, whoa. So the recommendation I have in terms of that chapter, the chapter is written from the standpoint of somebody who's making the request, but you can also look at it from the standpoint of the person who's receiving the request. So when you're receiving a request, you would like all that stuff to be there. Which means if it's not there, you could ask, you know, if Jen comes to me and she says, can you have this report for me by this time? I'd say, sure, do you have a couple minutes? I have a couple questions. Oh, okay. You know, I'm not really clear here where these resources come from. You know, I've done some of this, but I'm not sure, or I'm not sure about this, or any questions I have, because you want to get that information so you know what you're actually promising. Because the whole idea of the performance conversation, they don't happen in organizations much. They really don't. They're pretty much make a quick request and be done with it. So it's worth it if you begin to look at those questions. Yeah, no problem, I'd be happy. Can you tell me what this is for, so I have some idea of context? And you can do that very politely. It doesn't have to be like, you know, an argument with somebody. The other thing is, if somebody gives you a deadline, doesn't give you a deadline, if you're familiar with your schedule, you know whether or not that's something that you could manage to make happen. If you're not familiar with your schedule, then obviously you won't know what that is. And you could say, okay, if I have it for you by this time, will that be okay? So you can give them the deadline rather than asking them for one, because in many cases we haven't thought about when we want. We have an idea, sometime this week I'd like it, and if they don't give you a deadline, you say by when, it now puts them on the spot, and most of us get uncomfortable. And we haven't thought about it by when. If we had thought about it, we'd have told you probably. So now it's like I get flustered and I'm all kind of, I don't know, and I make something tomorrow. Oh, that's not going to work, and you know, we're now off to a debate. When you're not given one, I recommend that you can propose one to them, and then that becomes the deadline, and it's your imposed deadline. Generally, people are pretty responsive to that, because you know, you're one of the few groups where the whole organization's having that conversation, but when I'm only dealing with individual managers, people around them aren't doing that, so they get to give the deadline and it works fine. So you can take everything in that conversation, in that chapter, and reverse it from the standpoint of somebody who's being asked to do something. Do I have everything that I need in order to say yes? and then have a conversation with them to get the stuff that you actually need consistent with those questions. You should know all deadlines are arbitrary.
Ooh, write that down.
There's no such thing as a non-arbitrary deadline. Even when the IRS says it's due by the 15th, that's because somebody sat down and said, hey, let's make it the 15th of April. So what's the question?
How do you suggest I make a deadline?
Well, when do you
Fit
want
this
it by?
conversation.
When do you want it by?